Center for American Progress is a think tank that's supposedly on the left, obviously very much connected to the Democratic Party. Now, there are many blogs and websites and groups that are actually progressives and not necessarily connected to the Democratic Party. But Center for American Progress runs ThinkProgress, which is a blog that purports to be progressive and oftentimes is certainly so. There's great information on there, and there's good people that work there, whether they're the writers, they're the people who get the research, etc. But there's always been concern that they are connected to the Democratic Party. Well, it turns out that concern was warranted. Zaid Jilani was a blogger for ThinkProgress, and he said that he did not want to support Obama's policies on Afghanistan. Well, what happened next throughout the course of several years is a very interesting story. And he finally came out with it now because of all the things that were in the news about RT. Now he says, look, yes, they are Russian-owned, and yes, they have certain biases. But understand that a lot of our media has certain biases. So he begins the explanation in 2009. He says, one of the controversial topics that was very constrained in our writing at ThinkProgress in 2009 was Afghanistan. Center for American Progress has decided not to protest Obama's surge, so most of our writing on the topic was simply neutral. We weren't supposed to take a strong stand. All right, already that's a huge problem. And if you're going to do that, you've got to at least say to the public, yes, we are not taking a stand on certain issues because we're connected to the White House. And I don't believe that they make that transparent. I think a lot of people in the know might know that. A lot of people on the right and the left might say, oh, you know Center for American Progress. John Podesta runs it. He's now in the Obama administration. Of course, he left CAP to do that. He was a chief of staff for Bill Clinton. He was Obama's transition head, et cetera. And he's actually one of the more progressive ones at CAP. But it's not enough to say, people in the industry roughly know it, okay? But it actually got worse after 2009. Before things went poorly, there was actually a tide of movement within the Democratic Party, and for a brief moment it looked like things were getting better. Zaid explains. Flash forward a couple of years, and the Democratic Party's lawmakers in Congress were in open revolt over the Afghanistan policy. Our writing at ThinkProgress had opened up a lot on this issue, and I was writing really critical stuff. And he talks about a piece that he wrote with a graph that was quoted on MSNBC and some other places. So, what happened next? But then, phone calls from the White House started pouring in, berating my bosses for being critical of Obama on this policy. And how do they react to that? Quote, soon afterwards, all of us, ThinkProgress national security bloggers, were called into a meeting with CAP senior staff and basically berated for opposing the Afghan war and creating daylight between us and Obama. Oh boy, that's terrible. They weren't even that obvious at MSNBC. So that is not a good sign when senior staff says, stop writing what you think. I don't want any daylight between you guys and President Obama. Zaid makes a really good point. Tell me again how bad RT is for being Russian run? Okay, and by the way, on RT, as we now know, Abby Martin was allowed to make a statement that was against the Russian government. I'm not defending RT's stance on Russia. I'm talking about the overall trends in all the media as Zaid is. Okay. Then Zaid explains, but what the meeting with CAP senior staff showed me was that they viewed being closer to Obama and aligning with his policy as more important than demonstrating progressive principle. It's hard to argue with that. That seems clear. Then he went on to say, essentially, we're doing the same thing as RT America is telling its American producers to do now. Align with your boss, who's the president of the country. Well, again, hard to argue. That's literally what they were doing, okay? He goes on to say, I wanted to work at a more independent outlet, but every place I've worked for since has its own editorial constraints and conflicts of interest. See, that's why this is a very thoughtful piece, and I think he's right. And he's like me, he thinks a lot of people that work at ThinkProgress, most of the people who work there are great. A lot of the people that work at Center for American Progress, smart, progressive, care about the issues, want to be on the right side. But they get corporate sponsors, they get donations from people like you, small donations, large donations, and they're obviously connected to the Democratic Party. That's what allowed them to criticize the Afghan war in the first place, because a lot of Democrats in Congress had revolted, and obviously incredibly aligned with President Obama. When right-wing sites did this during the Bush administration, we criticized them, and we said they were thoughtlessly cheerleading for Bush. You've got to do likewise when it's your own side. And in this case, it clearly looks like, I can't even say thoughtless in this case. They thought about it and they made a decision. We're going with Obama, and there's going to be no light between us and Obama. And finally, Zaid ends on this, which brings me to why we're all a little like RT America. The people who work at ThinkProgress today continue to do awesome, independent reporting, but they have a lot of constraints on them, and I'm sure they wish they didn't. But it's an unfortunate reality in many of the journalistic environments we exist today. We can't criticize certain people or dig into certain stories or follow our noses on the trail of corruption if it means upsetting our publishers, sponsors, and donors. That's why independent media is so monumentally important. Why the project that Greenwald, Scahill, etc. are starting now is so important. We hope that begins to change the dynamic in this country. But The Guardian, Salon, etc., all those independent sources are very important. Because the less independent you are, the more you're beholden to whether it's the government, corporations, parent companies that own your smaller company, sponsors, etc. All these things affect what goes on air. We wish they didn't, but a lot of it does. Now, maybe you're never gonna get a perfect journalistic enterprise. Maybe the guys that are looking to start the project with Pierre Omidyar are gonna keep in mind the eBay founders' ideology. We hope not, and they certainly have a track record of being wonderfully independent, and that's why he went with them. It's just something, as a reader, as a viewer, you gotta keep an eye on, including all outlets. In this particular case, with ThinkProgress, the internal news is not good, and it is certainly disappointing for those of us who wanted it to be more progressive, more aligned with principle, rather than simply partisan politics.